"Run with me tonight," the Duke of Blackmoor said, close to her ear, in the middle of her own betrothal ball. 14 miles there and back, and I will have you at your aunt's door by 5 o'clock with your name untouched, or marry him at 9 and be ruined for life. Those are the choices, and you have about a minute. Lucian felt the girl go rigid under his hand, and did not blame her in the least. They were halfway down a set. 90 people were watching the future Mrs. Aubrey Fitch dance with the Duke of Blackmoor, and 40 of them were counting how many words he said to her, because he had a reputation and she had none, and because he had crossed the room and asked for the dance in a voice that had turned heads. Delphine Caro did not miss the step. That was the first thing he came to admire about her. "Your Grace has been drinking," she said pleasantly. "I have not touched anything in this house, nor should you." He turned her under his arm. "Miss Caro, Aubrey Fitch was married on the 11th of April, 4 years ago, in the parish church at Coombe Rowley, to a woman named Susan Bright, who is alive and keeps a lodging house in that village. There is no divorce. There cannot be. Men like Fitch have not the money for an Act of Parliament and would not risk the noise. If you stand up with him at 9 tomorrow morning, you will not be his wife. You will be nothing at all in law, and whatever comes of it will be nothing at all. And your father's mill will be his by the settlement. And in 3 years he will leave you in a hired room in Bristol as he left her." The music went on. Her hand in his was perfectly steady and perfectly cold. "Prove it," Delphine said. "That is precisely what I am proposing to do. It is 14 miles to Coombe Rowley. The register is in the vestry chest, and the vicar there is 81 and deaf and entirely honest, and he will make me an attested copy at 3 in the morning if I put a lamp in his hand and speak loudly enough. But I must have you with me." "Why?" "Because I am the Duke of Blackmoor and nobody in this county believes a word I say," Lucian said. "If I bring that paper here alone, your uncle will call it forged and Fitch will call it spite, and the vicar of this parish will read the service out of sheer embarrassment. If you are standing beside me and swear you saw it taken from the chest, no clergyman in England will proceed." The set was ending. He had 10 seconds. "My Aunt Lady Roswell is in the carriage at the bottom of the shrubbery walk with a foot warmer and a Bible and an exceedingly bad temper. She will sit beside you there and back, and she will never leave the two of us alone for 1 minute of it. And in the morning she will say so to anyone who asks, and she has been saying inconvenient true things in this county for 60 years. That is my whole offer. There is nothing improper in it, and if I have misjudged you, tell your uncle in an hour and have me horsewhipped." He bowed, she curtsied. Somebody applauded the musicians. "The bottom of the shrubbery walk," Delphine said, "in a quarter of an hour," and went away to be admired by her fiancé's friends. Lucian went out to the terrace and stood in the cold with his hands behind his back, and discovered that his heart was going like a boy's. He had not intended any of this. He had come into the county in September to buy timber, and had stayed because of a dispute over a right-of-way, and he had been at 3 assemblies and had disliked all of them. What he had noticed at the second was Aubrey Fitch, a handsome, easy, laughing man of 30, with a way of putting his hand on other men's shoulders, whom Lucian had seen once before, 4 years earlier, in a lodging-house parlor at Coombe Rowley, when Lucian's own steward had lodged there through a bad winter. He had seen him come down the stairs of that house in his shirt-sleeves, and he had seen the woman at the foot of them, and he had heard the woman called Mrs. Fitch by the girl who brought the coals. A less obstinate man would have let it alone. It was no business of his whom a mill-owner's daughter married. But he had watched Delphine Caro for 6 weeks. He had watched her at her uncle's table, running a house she did not own for a guardian who resented the expense of her. He had watched her at the mill gate on a Friday, handing out the wages her father had paid for 40 years, and knowing every man's name and every man's wife's name. He had seen her, at the second assembly, take off her own shawl in the passage, and put it round a shivering fiddler's girl, and go back in with bare shoulders in November. And he had listened to her laugh at Fitch's jokes with her eyes somewhere else entirely, like a woman doing sums. The engagement had been announced in October. The mill had been in the settlement by November. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, standing in the churchyard of a parish that was not his own, Lucian had finally admitted to himself that he was not going to be able to live with it. The carriage went out of the park gates at midnight, with the lamps unlit. Lady Roswal, 78 in 3 shawls, said to Delphine, "Sit here, child, and take half the rug. My nephew has the manners of a smuggler, but he does not lie. He has never once lied to me, and I have given him every opportunity." "Thank you," Delphine said, and then to the dark of the carriage, "Your Grace, if it is true, what becomes of Mrs. Bright, of Susan?" Lucian had been asked a great many questions in his life. He had not expected that one to be the first. "She has been abandoned 4 years with a lodging house and a bad name," he said. "She could not prosecute. It would cost her £60 and her livelihood. If she will swear to it before a magistrate, I will stand the cost of the prosecution to the last farthing, and she shall have a settled income from me for the rest of her days, whether she swears or not." There was a silence in the carriage. "Then drive faster," said Delphine Caro. They were at Coombe Rowley at 10 minutes to 2. It took 20 minutes of hammering to raise the vicar, and a further 10 before the old man came out with a candle and his coat over his nightshirt and understood what was being asked. He was deaf, and he was 81, and he was, as Lucian had promised, entirely honest. When the chest was open and the register laid on the vestry table, he put his finger on the line and read it out at a shout, the way deaf men do. 11 April. Aubrey Fitch, bachelor of this parish. Susan Bright, spinster of this parish. By banns. Signed, witnessed, there is the mark of the woman's mother and no burial entry for either of them, and I have buried everyone in this village for 41 years, and I should know. Delphine stood over the page with the candle in both hands, and Lucian watched her read her own ruin in a stranger's handwriting, and not make a sound. Then she looked up. "Sir," she said to the vicar, very loudly and very clearly, "will you make me a copy in your own hand, attested, and sign it? And will you also write out that I, Delphine Caro, was present when the chest was opened, and that Lady Roswal stood at the door?" "I will make you 3 copies, young woman," said the vicar of Coombe Rowley, and sat down and cut a fresh pen. While the ink dried, she asked to be taken to the lodging-house. "It is 2 in the morning," Lucian said. "She is going to hear tomorrow from a magistrate's clerk or from a newspaper, or she may hear it tonight from the woman it was nearly done to." Delphine's chin was up. "Your Grace, I have 20 minutes and a candle, and I am not going to spend the rest of my life having been the girl who did not knock on that door." So they knocked on that door, and a woman of 35 in a wrapper opened it with a poker in her hand. And Lucian stood back in the street with his hat off, while Delphine Caro sat on the bottom stair of a lodging-house in Coombe Rowley for a quarter of an hour, holding the hand of Aubrey Fitch's lawful wife, and Lady Roswal sat above them on the 3rd step like a small, ferocious sentry. When they came out, Susan came out with them, in a bonnet with a box. "She will swear," Delphine said. "She wants to be in the church." The carriage came back into the village at 10 minutes past 5, and stopped at the aunt's door as promised, and Delphine Caro went in through her own front door with her name untouched, and 3 attested copies in her reticule, and the sun came up on a wedding morning. At 9 o'clock the church was full. Lucian stood at the back against the font with his hat in his hand. He had offered, in the carriage, to do the whole thing himself, to stand up at the words and put the paper in the vicar's hand, and take every particle of the noise on his own head, and never let her name into it at all. She had refused. "You have carried it for 6 weeks," she had said. "It is mine now." So it was Delphine Carew who came up that aisle in a white gown with a prayer book and a folded paper inside it, and who stopped 4 feet short of Aubrey Fitch, and who turned around and faced the congregation instead of the altar. What she said took 90 seconds. She said it in the same voice she used at the mill gate on a Friday, which carried to the back of the church without ever being raised. She gave the date, the parish, the names, the vicar's attestation. She said that the paper was in the vicar's hand and might be examined by anybody, that Lady Roswell had stood at the vestry door, and that the woman lawfully married on the 11th of April 4 years ago was at that moment sitting in the 3rd pew from the front in a gray bonnet, and would everybody please look at her, because she had done nothing wrong and had spent 4 years being blamed for it. Then she said, "I am not marrying anyone today. Uncle, you will not be paying for a wedding breakfast." Fitch made a bolt for the south door and got as far as the porch, where 2 of the Duke of Blackmoor's grooms happened to be standing, and where a constable from Marbury happened to be waiting with a warrant sworn out at 7 o'clock that morning by Susan Fitch of Coombe Rowley, at the cost of one nobleman who had promised to stand the whole expense of it. Lucian did not go near her for a month. That was deliberate, and it was the hardest thing he had done in his life. There was talk enough already that Blackmoor had taken a bride out of her betrothal ball at midnight, that the whole business was a scheme of his to get the mill, that he had wanted the girl and had removed the obstacle. He wrote to her once, formally, to say that the prosecution was in hand, that Mrs. Fitch's income was settled and irrevocable, and that if it would be of the smallest service to Miss Carew's reputation, he would leave the county by the week's end and never return to it. Her answer came back in 2 lines. "Do not you dare. Come to the mill gate on Friday at noon." He went to the mill gate on Friday at noon. She was there with the wages book, in a plain brown gown, with 300 people going past her, and she finished the last name before she looked up. "Your Grace, Miss Carew, they are saying in the town that you did it to get the mill." She closed the book. "My uncle is saying it loudest, since the settlement he would have had a share of has gone up in smoke. What do you say?" "I say I did it because I watched you take off your own shawl in a cold passage in November for a fiddler's girl you had never met," Lucian said, "and because on the day the settlement was signed I found that I could not eat my dinner. I have no interest in the mill. I will sign anything you like to that effect, before any lawyer you name, and I would have done the whole of it exactly the same if you had been 60 years old and disagreeable." Delphine Carew looked at him for a long moment in the noise of 300 people going home. "Nobody has ever spent 6 weeks being uneasy on my behalf," she said. "My father did, but he was obliged to. Your Grace Lucian, the night of the ball, when you said 14 miles there and back, and your name untouched, and then produced a 78-year-old woman with a foot warmer and a Bible so that nothing on this earth could be said of me afterwards. Do you know what I thought, standing in the shrubbery walk at 12:30? I do not. I thought, this is the first man who has troubled to protect the part of me that nobody profits from." Her eyes were bright. "You had a paper to win, and you brought a chaperone. It was the least romantic thing any man has ever done for me, and I have thought of nothing else for 5 weeks." Lucian discovered that he had to look away for a moment at the mill chimney. "May I call on you?" he said, "in a proper manner, with cards and dull conversation and your aunt in the room, for as long as it takes for this county to be thoroughly bored of us both." "You may call tomorrow," said Delphine. Bring your aunt. She is the only person in 6 weeks who has told me the truth without being asked, and I intend to be extremely fond of her." They were married the following September, from her aunt's house, with the banns read 3 times in the ordinary way in the ordinary parish, because the Duke of Blackmoor would not have a special license in that house for any money, and said so at every opportunity. Susan sat in the second pew in a new gray silk. Her name had been cleared in the county paper before the year was out, and she went back to calling herself Mrs. Bright, since the village had never once believed she was anything else, and she had no wish to carry a convict's name about with her. She kept her lodging house because she liked it, ran it on the Duke's settled income, and never let a room to a handsome man in a hurry for the rest of her life. And when their granddaughters asked the Duchess of Blackmoor how it had begun, she always gave the same answer, and her husband always let her tell it, standing behind her chair with his hand on the back of it. "A man I hardly knew whispered 4 words to me in the middle of a dance," she said, "and every one of them was true, and by 5 o'clock in the morning I was home with my name untouched and a piece of paper in my reticule. Never mind roses, my dears. Marry the one who thinks about your name at midnight when he could have had you at a gallop."